was fair and free, between the mountains and the sea. His sword was long, his lance was keen, his shining helm afar was seen. The countless stars of heaven's field were mirrored in his silver shield. But long ago he rode away, and where he dwelleth none can say. For into darkness fell his star, in Mordor where the shadows are.
The others turned in amazement, for the voice was Sam's. Said Merry.
"That's all I know,"
Stammered Sam, blushing.
I learned it from Mr. Bilbo when I was a lad. He used to tell me tales like that. Knowing how I was always one for hearing about elves, it was Mr. Bilbo as taught me my letters. He was mighty book-learned, was dear old Mr. Bilbo, and he wrote poetry. He wrote what I've just said.
He did not make it up, said Strider. It is part of the lay that is called The Fall of Gil-galad, which is an ancient tongue. Bilbo must have translated it. I never knew that.
There was a lot more,
said Sam.
It's all about Mordor. I didn't learn that part. It gave me shivers. I never thought I should be going that way myself.
Cried Pippin.
Do not speak that name so loudly, said Strider.
It was already midday when they drew nearer the southern end of the path, and saw before them in the pale clear light of the October sun a grey-green bank, leading up like a bridge on the northward slope of the hill. They decided to make for the top at once, while the daylight was broad. Concealment was no longer possible, and they could only hope that no enemy or spy was observing them. Nothing was to be seen moving on the hill. If Gandalf was anywhere about, there was no sign of him. On the western flank of Weathertop they found a sheltered hollow, at the bottom of which there was a bowl-shaped dell with grassy sides. There they left Sam and Pippin with the pony and their packs and luggage. The other three went on. After half an hour's plodding climb, Strider reached the crown of the hill. Frodo and Merry followed, tired and breathless. The last slope had been steep and rocky. On the top they found, as Strider had said, a wide ring of ancient stonework, now crumbling or covered with age-long grass. But in the center, a cairn of broken stones had been piled. They were blackened as if with fire. About them the turf was burned into the roots, and all within the ring the grass was scorched and shriveled, as if flames had swept the hilltop. But there was no sign of any living thing. Standing upon the rim of the ruined circle, they saw all around below them a wide prospect, for the most part of lands empty and featureless, except for patches of woodland away to the south, beyond which they caught here and there the glint of distant water. There ran like a ribbon the old road, coming out of the west and winding up and down until it faded behind a ridge of dark land to the east. Nothing was moving on it. Following its line eastward with their eyes, they saw the mountains. The nearer foothills were brown and sombre. Behind them stood taller shapes of grey, and behind those again were high white peaks glimmering among the clouds.
"Well, here we are,"
said Merry.
"And very cheerless and uninviting it looks. There's no water and no shelter, and no sign of Gandalf. But I don't blame him for not waiting if he ever came here."
"I wonder," said Strider, looking around thoughtfully. "Even if he was a day or two behind us at Bree, he could have arrived here first. He can ride very swiftly when need presses." Suddenly he stooped and looked at the stone on the top of the cairn. It was flatter than the others and whiter, as if it had escaped the fire. He picked it up and examined it, turning it with his fingers. "This has been handled recently," he said. Marks. On the flat underside, Frodo saw some scratches.
"There seems to be a stroke, a dot, and 3 more strokes," he said.
"The stroke on the left might be a G rune, with thin branches," said Strider. "It might be a sign left by Gandalf, though one cannot be sure. The scratches are fine, and they certainly look fresh, but the marks might mean something quite different, and have nothing to do with us. Rangers use runes, and they come here sometimes."
"What could they mean, even if Gandalf made them?"
asked Merry. "I should say," answered Strider, "that they stood for G3, and were a sign that Gandalf was here on October the 3rd. That is 3 days ago now. It will also show that he was in a hurry and danger was at hand, so that he had no time or did not dare to write anything longer or plainer. If that is so, we must be wary."
I wish we could feel sure that he made these marks, whatever they may mean," said Frodo. "It would be a great comfort to know that he was on the way, in front of us or behind us."
"Perhaps," said Strider. "For myself, I believe that he was here, and he was in danger. There have been scorching flames here, and now the light that we saw 3 nights ago in the eastern sky comes back to my mind. I guess that he was attacked on this hilltop, but with what result I cannot tell. He is here no longer, and we must now look after ourselves and make our own way to Rivendell, as best we can."
"How far is Rivendell?"
asked Merry, gazing around wearily. The world looked wild and wide from Withertop. "I do not know if the road has ever been measured in miles beyond the Forsaken Inn, a day's journey east of Bree," answered Strider. "Some say it is so far, and some say otherwise. It is a strange road, and folk are glad to reach their journey's end, whether the time is long or short. But I know how long it would take me on my own feet. With fair weather and no ill fortune, 12 days from here to the ford of Bruinen, where the road crosses the Loudwater that runs out of Rivendell. We have at least a fortnight's journey before us, but I do not think that we shall be able to use the road."
"A fortnight!" said Frodo. "A lot may happen in that time."
"It may," said Strider. They stood for a while silent on the hilltop, near its southward edge. In that lonely place Frodo for the first time fully realized his homelessness and danger. He wished bitterly that his fortune had left him in the quiet and beloved Shire. He stared down at the hateful road leading back westward to his home. Suddenly he was aware that 2 black specks were moving slowly along it, going westward, and looking again, he saw the 3 others were creeping eastward to meet them. He gave a cry and clutched Strider's arm.
"Look!"
he said, pointing downwards. At once Strider flung himself on the ground behind the ruined circle, pulling Frodo down beside him. Merry threw himself alongside.
"What is it?"
he whispered. "I do not know, but I fear the worst," answered Strider. Slowly they crawled up to the edge of the ring again, and peered through a cleft between 2 jagged stones. The light was no longer bright, for the clear morning had faded, and clouds creeping out from the east had now overtaken the sun as it began to go down. They could all see the black specks, but neither Frodo nor Merry could make out their shapes for certain. Yet something told them that there, far below, were black riders assembling on the road beyond the foot of the hill. "Yes," said Strider, whose keener sight left him in no doubt. "The enemy is here." Hastily they crept away and slipped down the north side of the hill to find their companions. Sam and Peregrine had not been idle. They had explored the small dell and surrounding slopes. Not far away they found a spring of clear water in the hillside, and near it footprints not more than a day or 2 old. In the dell itself they found recent traces of a fire, and some signs of a hasty camp. There were some fallen rocks on the edge of the dell nearest to the hill. Behind them Sam came upon a small stone of firewood neatly stacked.
"I wonder if old Gandalf has been here,"
he said to Pippin.
"Whoever it was put this stuff here meant to come back, it seems."
Strider was greatly interested in these discoveries. "I wish I had waited and explored the ground down here myself," he said, hurrying off the spring to examine the footprints. "It is just as I feared," he said when he came back. "Sam and Pippin have trampled the soft ground, and the marks are spoiled or confused. Rangers have been here lately. It is they who left the firewood behind. But there are also several newer tracks that were not made by rangers. At least one set was made, only a day or 2 ago, by heavy boots. At least one. I cannot now be certain, but I think there were many booted feet." He paused and stood in ancient thought. Each of the hobbits saw in his mind a vision of the cloaked and booted riders. If the horsemen had already found the dell, the sooner Strider led them somewhere else, the better. Sam viewed the hollow with great dislike, now that he had heard news of their enemies on the road only a few miles away.
"Hadn't we better clear out quick, Mr. Strider?"
he asked impatiently.
"It is getting late, and I don't like the hole. It makes my heart sing somehow."
"Yes, we certainly must decide what to do at once," answered Strider, looking up and considering the time and the weather. "Well, Sam," he said at last, "I do not like this place either. But I cannot think of anywhere better than we could reach before nightfall. At least we are out of sight for the moment, and if we moved we should be much more likely to be seen by spies. All we could do would be to go right out of our way, back north on this side of the line of hills, where the land is all much the same as it is here. The road is watched, but we should have to cross it if we tried to take cover in the thickness away to the south. On the north side of the road beyond the hills the country is bare and flat for miles."
"Can riders see?"
asked Mary.
I mean, they seem usually to have used their noses rather than their eyes, smelling for us. If smelling is the right word. At least in the daylight. But you made us lie down flat when you saw them down below. And now you talk of being seen if we move.
I was too careless on the hilltop, answered Strider. I was very anxious to find some sign of Gandalf, but it was a mistake for 3 of us to go up and stand there for so long. For the black horses can see, and the riders can use men and other creatures as spies, as we found at Bree. They themselves do not see the world of light as we do, but our shapes cast shadows in their minds, which only the noon sun destroys. And in the dark they perceive many signs and forms that are hidden from us. Then they are most to be feared. And at all times they smell the blood of living things, desiring and hating it. Senses, too, there are, other than sight or smell. We can feel their presence. It troubled our hearts as soon as we came here, and before we saw them. They feel ours much more keenly. Also, he added, and his voice sank to a whisper, the ring draws them.
Is there no escape then?
Said Frodo, looking round wildly.
If I move, I shall be seen and hunted. If I stay, I shall draw them to me.
Strider laid his hand on his shoulder. There is still hope, he said. You are not alone. Let us take this wood that is set ready for the fire as a sign. There is little shelter or defence here, but fire shall serve for both. Sauron can put fire to his evil uses, as he can all things, but these riders do not love it, and fear those who wield it. Fire is our friend in the wilderness.
Maybe, muttered Sam, but it's also a good way of saying here we are, as I can think of bar shouting.
Down in the lower and most sheltered corner of the dell they lit a fire, and prepared a meal. The shades of evening began to fall, and it grew cold. They were suddenly aware of great hunger, for they had not eaten anything since breakfast, but they dared not make more than a frugal supper. The lands ahead were empty of all save birds and beasts, unfriendly places deserted by all the races of the world. Rangers passed at times beyond the hills, but they were few and did not stay. Other wanderers were rare, and of evil sort. Trolls might stray down at times, out of the northern valleys of the misty mountains. Only to the road would travellers be found. Most often dwarves, hurrying along, on business of their own, and with no help and few words to spare for strangers.
I don't see how our food can be made to last, said Frodo. We have been careful enough in the last few days, and this supper is no feast, but we have used more than we ought. If we have 2 weeks still to go, and perhaps more...
There is food in the wild, said Strider. Berry, root, and herb, and I have some skill as a hunter at need. You need not be afraid of starving before winter comes, but gathering and catching food is long and weary work, and we need haste. So tighten your belts, and think with hope of the tables of Elrond's house. The cold increased as darkness came on. Peering out from the edge of the dell, they could see nothing but a grey land now vanishing quickly into shadow. The sky above had cleared again, and was slowly filled with twinkling stars. Frodo and his companions huddled around the fire, wrapped in every garment and blanket they possessed, but Strider was content with a single cloak, and sat a little apart, drawing thoughtfully at his pipe. As night fell and the light of the fire began to shine out brightly, he began to tell them tales to keep their minds from fear. He knew many histories and legends of long ago, of elves and men, and the good and evil deeds of the elder days. They wondered how old he was, and where he had learned all this lore.
Tell us of Gil-galad,
said Merry suddenly, when he paused at the end of a story of the elf kingdoms.
Do you know any more of that old lay that you spoke of?
I do indeed, answered Strider. So also does Frodo, for it concerns us closely. Merry and Pippin looked at Frodo, who was staring into the fire.
I know only the little that Gandalf has told me, said Frodo slowly. Gil-galad was the last of the great elf kings of Middle-earth. Gil-galad is starlight, in their tongue. With Elendil, the elf friend, he went to the land of
No, said Strider, interrupting. I do not think that tale should be told now with the servants of the enemy at hand. If we win through to the house of Elrond, you may hear it there, told in full.
Begged Sam.
I will tell you the tale of Tinuviel, said Strider. In brief, for it is a long tale which the end is not known, and there are none now except Elrond that remember it aright, as it was told of old. It is a fair tale, though it is sad, as are all the tales of Middle-earth, and yet it may lift up your hearts. He was silent for some time, and then he began not to speak, but to chant softly. The leaves were long, the grass was green, the hemlock umbels tall and fair, and in the glade a light was seen, of stars in shadow shimmering. Tinuviel was dancing there, to music of a pipe unseen, and light of stars was in her hair, and in her raiment glimmering. There Beren came from mountains cold, and lost he wandered under leaves, and where the elven river rolled, he walked alone and sorrowing. He peered between the hemlock leaves, and saw in wonder flowers of gold upon her mantle and her sleeves, and her hair like shadow following. Enchantment healed his weary feet, that over hills were doomed to roam, and forth he hastened strong and fleet, and grasped at moonbeams glistening. Through woven woods in elven home she slightly fled on dancing feet, and left him lonely, still to roam in the silent forest listening. He heard there oft the flying sound of fleet as light as linden leaves, or music welling underground, in hidden hollows quavering. Now withered lay the hemlock leaves, and one by one with sighing sound, whispering fell the beech's leaves, in the wintry woodland wavering. He sought her ever, wandering far, where leaves of years were thickly strewn, by light of moon and ray of star, in frosty heavens shivering. Her mantle glinted in the moon, as on a hilltop high and far she danced, and at her feet was strewn a mist of silver quivering. When river passed she came again, and her song released the sudden spring, like rising dark and falling rain, and melting water bubbling. He saw the elven flowers spring about her feet and healed again. He longed by her to dance and sing upon the grass untroubling. Again she fled, but swift he came, Tinuviel, Tinuviel. He called her by her elvish name, and there she halted, listening. One moment stood she, and a spell his voice laid on her. Beren came, and doom fell on Tinuviel, that in his arms lay glistening. As Beren looked into her eyes, within the shadows of her hair, the trembling starlight of the skies, he saw there mirrored shimmering. Tinuviel the elven fair, immortal maiden, elven wise, about him cast her shadowy hair, and arms like silver glimmering. Long was the way that fate them bore. There are stony mountains, cold and grey, through falls of iron and darkling door, and woods of nightshade morrowless. The sundering seas between them lay, and yet at last they met once more, and long ago they passed away, in the forest singing sorrowless. Strider sighed and paused before he spoke again. That is called Anthenoth among the elves, but is hard to remember in our common speech. But this is but a rough echo of it. It tells of the meeting of Beren, son of Barahir, and Luthien Tinuviel. Beren was a mortal man, but Luthien was the daughter of Thingol, a king of elves upon Middle-earth, when the world was young, and she was the fairest maiden that has ever been among all the children of this world. As the stars above the mists of the northern lands was her loveliness, and in her face was a shining light. In those days the great enemy, of whom Sauron of Mordor was but a servant, dwelt in Angband in the north, and the elves of the west, coming back to Middle-earth, made war upon him to regain the Silmarils which he had stolen, and the fathers of men aided the elves. But the enemy was victorious, and Barahir was slain, and Beren, escaping through great peril, came over the mountains of terror into the kingdom of Thingol in the forest of Neldoreth. There he beheld Luthien, singing and dancing in a glade beside the enchanted river Esgalduin, and he named her Tinuviel, that is the nightingale in the language of the old. Many sorrows befell them afterwards, and they were parted long, Tinuviel rescued Beren from the dungeons of Sauron, and together they passed through great dangers, and cast down even the great enemy from his throne, and took from his iron crown one of the 3 Silmarils, brightest of all jewels, to be the bride price of Luthien to Thingol, her father. Yet at last Beren was slain by the wolf that came from the gates of Angband, and he died in the arms of Tinuviel. But she chose mortality, and to die from the world so that she might follow him, and it is sung that they met again beyond the sundering seas, and after a brief time walking alive once more in the green woods, together they passed, long ago, beyond the confines of this world. So it is that Luthien Tinuviel alone of the elf kindred has died indeed, and left the world, and they have lost her whom they most loved. But from her lineage of the elf lords of old, descended upon men, there live still those of whom Luthien was the foremother, and it is said that her line shall never fail. Elrond of Rivendell is of that kin. For of Beren and Luthien was born Dior Thingol's heir, and of him Elwing the White, whom Eärendil wedded, he that sailed his ship out of the mists of the world into the seas of heaven with the Silmaril upon his brow. And of Eärendil came the kings of Númenor, that is Westernesse. As Strider was speaking, they watched his strange, eager face, dimly lit with the red glow of the wood fire. His eyes shone, and his voice was rich and deep. Above him was a black, starry sky. Suddenly a pale light appeared over the crown at Weathertop behind him. The waxing moon was climbing slowly above the hill that foreshadowed them, and the stars above the hilltop faded. The story ended. The hobbits moved and stretched.
"Look," said Merry, "the moon is rising. It must be getting late."
The others looked up. Even as they did so, they saw on the top of the hill something small and dark against the glimmer of the moonrise. It was perhaps only a strange stone or jutting rock shown up by the pale light. Sam and Merry got up and walked away from the fire. Frodo and Pippin remained seated in silence. Strider was watching the moonlight on the hill intently. All seemed quiet and still, but Frodo felt a cold dread creeping over his heart, now that Strider was no longer speaking. He huddled closer to the fire. At that moment Sam came running back from the edge of the dell.
"I don't know what it is," he said, "but I suddenly felt afraid. I daresn't go outside this dell for any money. I felt that something was creeping up the slope." "Did you see anything?"
asked Frodo, springing to his feet.
"No, sir, I saw nothing, but I did not stop to look." "I saw something," said Merry, "or I thought I did, away westwards where the moonlight was falling on the flats beyond the shadow of the hilltops. I thought there were 2 or 3 black shapes. They seemed to be moving this way."
"Keep close to the fire, with your faces outward," cried Strider. "Get some of the longer sticks ready in your hands." For a breathless time they sat there, silent and alert, with their backs turned to the wood fire, each gazing into the shadows that encircled them. There was no sound of movement in the night. Frodo stirred, feeling that he must break the silence. He longed to shout aloud. "Hush!" whispered Strider.
"What's that?"
gasped Pippin at the same moment. Over the lip of the little dell, on the side away from the hill, they felt, rather than saw, a shadow rise. One shadow or more than one. They strained their eyes, and the shadows seemed to grow. Soon there could be no doubt. 3 or 4 tall black figures were standing there on the slope, looking down on them. So black were they that they seemed like black holes in the deep shade behind them. Frodo thought that he heard the faint hiss as of venomous breath, and felt a thin, piercing chill. Then the shapes slowly advanced. Terror overcame Pippin and Merry, and they threw themselves flat on the ground. Sam shrank to Frodo's side. Frodo was hardly less terrified than his companions. He was quaking as if he was bitter cold, but his terror was swallowed up in a sudden temptation to put on the ring. The desire to do this laid hold of him, and he could think of nothing else. He did not forget the barrow, nor the message of Gandalf, but something seemed to be compelling him to disregard all warnings, and he longed to yield. Not with the hope of escape or of doing anything, either good or bad. He simply felt that he must take the ring and put it on his finger. He could not speak. He felt Sam looking at him, as if he knew that his master was in some great trouble, but he could not turn towards him. He shut his eyes and struggled for a while, but the resistance became unbearable. And at last he slowly drew out the chain and slipped the ring on the forefinger of his left hand. Immediately, though everything else remained as before, dim and dark, the shapes became terribly clear. He was able to see beneath their black wrappings. There were 5 tall figures, 2 standing on the lip of the dell, 3 advancing, with their white faces burned keen and merciless eyes. Under their mantles were long grey robes, upon their grey hairs were helms of silver, and their haggard hands were swords of steel. Their eyes fell on him and pierced him as they rushed towards him. Desperate, he drew his own sword, and it seemed to him that it flickered red, as if it was a firebrand. 2 of the figures halted. The third was taller than the others. His hair was long and gleaming, and on his helm was a crown. In one hand he held a long sword, and in the other a knife. Both the knife and the hand that held it glowed in a pale light. He sprang forward and bore down on Frodo. At that moment Frodo threw himself forward on the ground, and he heard himself crying aloud. At the same time he struck at the feet of his enemy. A shrill cry rang out in the night, and he felt a pain like a dart of poisoned ice pierce his left shoulder. Even as he swooned, he caught, as through a swirling mist, a glimpse of Strider leaping out of the darkness, with a flaming brand of wood in either hand. With a last effort, Frodo, dropping his sword, slipped the ring from his finger and closed his right hand tight upon it. When Frodo came to himself, he was still clutching the ring desperately. He was lying by the fire, which was now piled high and burning brightly. His 3 companions were bending over him.
What has happened? Where is the Pale King?
He asked wildly. They were too overjoyed to hear him speak to answer for a while, nor did they understand his question. At length he gathered from Sam that they had seen nothing but the vague shadowy shapes coming toward them. Suddenly, to his horror, Sam found that his master had vanished, and at that moment a black shadow rushed past him, and he fell. He heard Frodo's voice, but it seemed to come from a great distance, or from under the earth, crying out strange words. They saw nothing more until they stumbled over the body of Frodo, lying as if dead, face downwards on the grass with his sword beneath him. Strider ordered them to pick him up and lay him near the fire. And then he disappeared. That was now a good while ago. Sam plainly was beginning to have doubts again about Strider, but while they were talking he returned, appearing suddenly out of the shadows. They started, and Sam drew his sword and stood over Frodo, but Strider knelt down swiftly at his side. "I am not a Black Rider, Sam," he said gently, "nor in league with them. I have been trying to discover something for other movements, but I have found nothing. I cannot think why they have gone and do not attack again, but there is no feeling of their presence anywhere at hand." When he heard what Frodo had to tell, he became full of concern and shook his head and sighed. Then he ordered Pippin and Merry to heat as much water as they could in their small kettles and to bathe the wound with it. "Keep the fire going well, and keep Frodo warm," he said. Then he got up and walked away, and called Sam to him. "I think I understand things better now," he said in a low voice. "There seem only to have been 5 of the enemy. Why they were not all there I do not know, but I don't think they expected to be resisted. They have drawn off for the time being, but not far, I fear. They will come again another night, if we cannot escape. They are only waiting, because they think that their purpose is almost accomplished, and that the ring cannot fly much further. I fear, Sam, that they believe your master has a deadly wound that will subdue him to their will. We shall see." Sam choked with tears. "Don't despair," said Strider. "You must trust me now. Your Frodo is made of sterner stuff than I had guessed, though Gandalf hinted that it might prove so. He is not slain, and I think he will resist the evil power of the wound longer than his enemies expect. I will do all I can to help and heal him. Guard him well while I am away." He hurried off and disappeared again into the darkness. Frodo dozed, though the pain of his wound was slowly growing, and a deadly chill was spreading from his shoulder to his arm and side. His friends watched over him, warming him and bathing his wound. The night passed slowly and wearily. Dawn was growing in the sky, and the dell was filling with grey light when Strider at last returned. "Look!" he cried, and stooping he lifted from the ground a black cloak that had lain there hidden by the darkness. A foot above the lower hem there was a slash. "This was the stroke of Frodo's sword," he said. "The only hurt that it did to his enemy, I fear, for it is unharmed. But all blades perish that pierce the dreadful king. More deadly to him was the name of Elbereth, and more deadly to Frodo was this." He stooped again and lifted up a long, thin knife. There was a cold gleam in it. As Strider raised it, they saw that near the end its edge was notched and the point was broken off. But even as he held it up in the growing light, they gazed in astonishment, for the blade seemed to melt and vanished like a smoke in the air, leaving only the hilt in Strider's hand. "Alas!" he cried. "It was this accursed knife that gave the wound. Few now have the skill in healing to match such evil weapons. But I will do what I can." He sat down on the ground and taking the dagger hilt laid it on his knees, and he sang over it a slow song in a strange tongue. Then, setting it aside, he turned to Frodo and in a soft tone spoke words the others could not catch. From the pouch at his belt he drew out the long leaves of a plant. "These leaves," he said, "I have walked far to find. For this plant does not grow in the bare hills, but in the thickets away south in the road I found it in the dark by the scent of its leaves." He crushed a leaf in his fingers, and it gave out a sweet and pungent fragrance. "It is fortunate that I could find it, for it is a healing plant that the men of the West brought to Middle-earth. Athalas they name it, and it grows now sparsely and only near places where they dwelt or camped of old. And it is not known in the north except for some of those who wander in the wild. It has great virtues, but over such a wound as this its healing powers may be small." He threw the leaves into boiling water and bathed Frodo's shoulder. The fragrance of the steam was refreshing, and those that were unhurt felt their minds calmed and cleared. The herb had also some power over the wound, for Frodo felt the pain and also the sense of frozen cold lessen in his side, but the life did not return to his arm, and he could not raise or use his hand. He bitterly regretted his foolishness, and reproached himself for weakness of will, for he now perceived that in putting on the ring he obeyed not his own desire, but the commanding wish of his enemies. He wondered if he would remain maimed for life, and how they would now manage to continue their journey. He felt too weak to stand. The others were discussing this very question. They quickly decided to leave Weathertop as soon as possible. "I think now," said Strider, "that the enemy has been watching this place for some days. If Gandalf ever came here, then he must have forced to ride away, and he will not return. In any case, we are in great peril here after dark, since the attack of last night, and we can hardly meet greater danger wherever we go." As soon as the daylight was full, they had some hurried food and packed. It was impossible for Frodo to walk, so they divided the greater part of their baggage among the four of them, and put Frodo on the pony. In the last few days the poor beast had improved wonderfully. It already seemed fatter and stronger, and had begun to show an affection for its new masters, especially for Sam. Bill Ferny's treatment must have been very hard, for the journey in the wild to seem so much better than its former life. They started off in a southerly direction. This would mean crossing the road, but it was the quickest way to more wooded country. And they needed fuel, for Strider said that Frodo must be kept warm, especially at night, while fire would be some protection for them all. It was also his plan to shorten their journey by cutting across another great loop of the road. East beyond Weathertop it changed its course and took a wide bend northwards. They made their way slowly and cautiously round the southwestern slope of the hill and came in a little while to the edge of the road. There was no sign of the riders, but even as they were hurrying across they heard far away two cries. A cold voice calling and a cold voice answering. Trembling, they sprang forward and made for the thickets that lay ahead. The land before them sloped away southwards, but it was wild and pathless. Bushes and stunted trees grew in dense patches with wide barren spaces in between. The grass was scanty, coarse and grey, and the leaves in the thickets were faded and falling. It was a cheerless land, and their journey was slow and gloomy. They spoke little as they trudged along. Frodo's heart was grieved as he watched them walking beside him with their heads down, and their backs bowed under their burdens. Even Strider seemed tired and heavy-hearted. Before the first day's march was over, Frodo's pain began to grow again, but he did not speak of it for a long time. 4 days passed, without the ground or the scene changing much, except that behind them Weathertop slowly sank, and before them the distant mountains loomed a little nearer. Yet since that far cry they had seen and heard no sign that the enemy has marked their flight or followed them. They dreaded the dark hours, and kept watch in pairs by night, expecting that at any time to see black shapes stalking in the grey night, dimly lit by the cloud-veiled moon. But they saw nothing, and heard no sound but the sight of withered leaves and grass. Not once did they feel the sense of present evil that had assailed them before the attack in the dell. It seemed too much to hope that the riders had already lost their trail again. Perhaps they were waiting to make some ambush in a narrow place. At the end of the 5th day, the ground began once more to rise slowly out of the wide, shallow valley into which they had descended. Strider now turned their course again northeastwards, and on the 6th day they reached the top of a long, slow climbing slope, and saw far ahead a huddle of wooden hills. Away below them they could see the road sweeping round the feet of the hills, and to their right a grey river gleamed pale in the thin sunshine. In the distance they glimpsed yet another river in a stony valley half veiled in mist. "I'm afraid we must go back to the road here for a while," said Strider. "We have now come to the river Horwell, that the elves call Methethel. It falls down out of the Etten Moors. The Trollfell is north of Rivendell and joins the Loudwater away in the south. Some call it the Grey Flood after that. It is a great water before it finds the sea. There is no way over it below its sources in the Etten Moors except by the last bridge on which the road crosses." asked Merry. "That is Loudwater, the Bruinen of Rivendell," answered Strider. "The road runs along the edge of the hills for many miles from the bridge to the ford of Bruinen, but I have not yet thought how we shall cross that water. One river at a time. We shall be fortunate indeed if we do not find the last bridge held against us." Next day, early in the morning, they came down again to the borders of the road. Sam and Strider went forward, but they found no sign of any travellers or riders. Here under the shadow of the hills there had been some rain. Strider judged that it had fallen 2 days before, and had washed away all footprints. No horsemen had passed since then, as far as he could see. They hurried along with all the speed they could make, and after a mile or two they saw the last bridge ahead, at the bottom of a short steep slope. They dreaded to see black figures waiting there, but they saw none. Strider made them take cover in a thicket at the side of the road, while he went forward to explore. Before long he came hurrying back. "I can see no sign of the enemy," he said, "and I wonder very much what that means, but I have found something very strange." He held out his hand and showed a single pale green jewel. "I found it in the mud in the middle of the bridge," he said. "It is a beryl, an elf stone. Whether it was set here or let fall by chance, I cannot say, but it brings hope to me. I will take it as a sign that we may pass the bridge, but beyond that, I dare not keep to the road, without some clearer token." At once they went on again. They crossed the bridge in safety, hearing no sound but the water swirling against its 3 great arches. A mile further on they came to a narrow ravine that led away northward through the steep lands on the left of the road. Here Strider turned aside, and soon they were lost in a sombre country of dark trees, winding among the fields of sullen hills. The hobbits were glad to leave the cheerless land and the perilous road behind them, but this new country seemed threatening and unfriendly. As they went forward, the hills about them steadily rose. Here and there upon heights and ridges they caught glimpses of ancient walls of stone, and the ruins of towers. They had an ominous look. Frodo, who was not walking, had time to gaze ahead and to think. He recalled Bilbo's account of his journey, and the threatening towers on the hills north of the road, in the country near the Troll's Wood, where his first serious adventure had happened. Frodo guessed that they were now in the same region, and wondered if by chance they would pass near the spot.
"Who lives in this land?" he asked. "And who built these towers? Is it troll country?"
"No," said Strider. "Trolls do not build. No one lives in this land. Men once dwelt here, ages ago, but none remain now. They became an evil people, as legends tell, for they fell under the shadow of Ingmar. But all were destroyed in the war that brought the North Kingdom to its end. But that is now so long ago that the hills have forgotten them, though a shadow still lies on the land."
"Where did you learn such tales if all the land is empty and forgetful?"
asked Peregrine.
"The birds and beasts do not tell tales of that sort."
"The ears of Elendil do not forget all things past," said Strider, "and many more things that I can tell are remembered in Rivendell."
"Have you often been to Rivendell?"
said Frodo. "I have," said Strider. "I dwelt there once, and still I return when I may. There my heart is, but it is not my fate to sit in peace, even in the fair house of Elrond."
The hills now began to shut them in. The road behind held on its way to the river Bruinen, but both were now hidden from view.
The travellers came into a long valley, narrow, deeply cloven, dark, and silent. Trees with old and twisted roots hung over cliffs and piled up behind 2 mounting slopes of pine wood. The hobbits grew very weary. They advanced slowly, for they had to pick their way through a pathless country encumbered by fallen trees and tumbled rocks. As long as they could, they avoided climbing for Frodo's sake, and because it was in fact difficult to find any way up out of the narrow dales. They had been 2 days in this country when the weather turned wet. The wind began to blow steadily out of the west and pour the water of the distant seas on the dark heads of the hills in fine drenching rain. By nightfall they were all soaked, and their camp was cheerless, for they could not get any fire to burn. The next day the hills rose, still higher and deeper before them, and they were forced to turn away northward, out of their course. Strider seemed to be getting anxious. They were nearly 10 days out from Rethertop, and their stock of provisions was beginning to run low. It went on raining. That night they camped on a stony shelf with a rock wall behind them, in which there was a shallow cave, a mere scoop in the cliff. Frodo was restless. The cold and wet had made his wound more painful than ever, and the ache and sense of deadly chill took away all sleep. He lay tossing and turning and listening fearfully to the stealthy night noises. Wind and chinks of rock, water dripping, a crack, the sudden rattling fall of a loosened stone. He felt that black shapes were advancing to smother him. But when he sat up he saw nothing but the back of Strider sitting hunched up smoking his pipe, and watching. He lay down again, and passed into an uneasy dream, in which he walked on the grass in his garden in the Shire, but it seemed faint and dim, less clear than the tall black shadows that stood looking over the hedge. In the morning he woke to find that the rain had stopped. The clouds were still thick, but they were breaking, and pale strips of blue appeared between them. The wind was shifting again. They did not start early. Immediately after their cold and comfortless breakfast, Strider went off alone, telling the others to remain under the shelter of the cliff until he came back. He was going to climb up if he could, and get a look at the lie of the land. When he returned, he was not reassuring. "We have gone too far to the north," he said, "and we must find some way to turn back southwards again. If we keep on as we are going, we shall get up to the Etendales, far north of Rivendell, and that is troll country, and little known to me. We could perhaps find our way through and come round to Rivendell from the north, but it would take too long, for I do not know the way, and our food would not last. So somehow or other we must find the ford of Bruinen." The rest of that day they spent scrambling over rocky ground. They found a passage between 2 hills that led them into a valley running southeast, a direction that they wished to take. But towards the end of the day they found their road again barred by a bridge of high land. Its dark edge against the sky was broken into many bare points like teeth of a blunted saw. They had a choice between going back or climbing over it. They decided to attempt to climb, but it proved very difficult. Before long Frodo was obliged to dismount and struggle along on foot. Even so, they often despaired of getting their pony up, of finding a path for themselves, burdened as they were. The light was nearly gone, and they were all exhausted, when at last they reached the top. They had climbed on to a narrow saddle between 2 higher points, and the land fell steeply away again, only a short distance ahead. Frodo threw himself down and lay on the ground, shivering. His left arm was lifeless, and his side and shoulder felt as if icy claws were laid upon them. The trees and rocks about him seemed shadowy and dim. Said Merry to Strider, "We shall see," answered Strider. "There is nothing more that I can do in the wilderness, and it is chiefly because of this wound that I am so anxious to press on. But I agree that we can go no further tonight."
"What's the matter with my master?"
asked Sam in a low voice, looking appealingly at Strider.
"His wound was small, and it's really closed. There's nothing to be seen but a cold white mark on his shoulder."
"Frodo has been touched by the weapons of the enemy," said Strider, "and there is some poison or evil at work that is beyond my skill to drive out. But do not give up hope, Sam." Night was cold up on the high ridge. They lit a small fire down under the gnarled roots of an old pine that hung over a shallow pit. It looked as if stone had once been quarried there. They sat huddled together. The wind blew chill through the pass, and they heard the treetops lower down moaning and sighing. Frodo lay half in a dream, imagining that endless dark wings were sweeping by above him, and that on the wings rode pursuers that sought him in all the hollows of the hills. The morning dawned bright and fair. The air was clean, and the light pale and clear in a rain-washed sky. Their hearts were encouraged, but they longed for the sun to warm their cold, stiff limbs. As soon as it was light, Strider took Merry with him and went to survey the country from the height to the east of the pass. The sun had risen and was shining brightly when he returned with more comforting news. They were now going more or less in the right direction. If they went on, down the further side of the ridge, they would have the mountains on their left. Some way ahead Strider had caught a glimpse of the loud water again, and he knew that, though it was hidden from view, the road to the ford was not far from the river, and lay on the side nearest to them. "We must make for the road again," he said. "We cannot hope to find a path through these hills. Whatever danger may beset it, the road is our only way to the ford." As soon as they had eaten, they set out again. They climbed slowly down the southern side of the ridge, but the way was much easier than they had expected, for the slope was far less steep on this side, and before long Frodo was able to ride again. Bill Ferny's poor old pony was developing an unexpected talent for picking out a path, and for sparing its rider as many jolts as possible. The spirits of the party rose again. Even Frodo felt better in the morning light, but every now and again a mist seemed to obscure its sight, and he passed his hands over his eyes. Pippin was a little ahead of the others. Suddenly he turned around and called to them.
There is a path here,
he cried. When they came up with him, they saw that he had made no mistake. There were clearly the beginnings of a path that climbed with many windings out of the woods below and faded away on the hilltop behind. In places it was now faint and overgrown, or choked with fallen stones and trees, but at one time it seemed to have been much used. It was a path made by strong arms and heavy feet. Here and there old trees had been cut or broken down, and large rocks cloven or heaved aside to make a way. They followed the track for some while, for it offered much the easiest way down, but they went cautiously, and their anxiety increased as they came into the dark woods, and the path grew plainer and broader. Suddenly, coming out of a belt of fir trees, it ran steeply down a slope, and turned sharply to the left around the corner of a rocky shoulder of the hill. When they came to the corner, they looked around and saw that the path ran on over a level strip under the face of a low cliff overhung with trees. In the stony wall there was a door hanging crookedly ajar upon one great hinge. Outside the door they all halted. There was a cave or rock chamber behind, but in the gloom inside nothing could be seen. Strider, Sam, and Merry, pushing it with all their strength, managed to open the door a little wider, and then Strider and Merry went in. They did not go far, for on the floor lay many old bones, and nothing else was to be seen near the entrance except some great empty jars and broken pots.
"Ooh, surely this is a troll hole if ever there was one,"
said Pippin.
"Come out, you two, and let us get away. Now we know who made the path, and we had better get off it quick."
"There is no need, I think," said Strider, coming out. "It is certainly a troll hole, but it seems to have been long forsaken. I don't think we need be afraid, but let us go on down warily, and we shall see." The path went on again from the door, and turning to the right again across the level space plunged down a thick wooden slope. Pippin, not liking to show Strider that he was still afraid, went on ahead with Merry. Sam and Strider came behind, one on each side of Frodo's pony, for the path was now broad enough for 4 or 5 hobbits to walk abreast. But they had not gone very far before Pippin came running back, followed by Merry. They both looked terrified.
There are trolls,
Pippin panted.
down in a clearing in the woods not far below. We've got a sight of them through the tree trunks. They're very large.
"We will come and look at them," said Strider, picking up a stick. Frodo said nothing, but Sam looked scared. The sun was now high and shone down through the half-stripped branches of the trees and lit the clearing with bright patches of light. They halted suddenly on the edge and peered through the tree trunks, holding their breath. There stood the trolls, 3 large trolls. One was stooping, and the other 2 stood staring at him. Strider walked forward unconcernedly. "Get up, old stone," he said, and broke his stick upon the stooping troll. Nothing happened. There was a gasp of astonishment from the hobbits, and then even Frodo laughed.
"Well," he said, "we are forgetting our family history. These must be the very 3 that were caught by Gandalf quarrelling over the right way to cook 13 dwarves and 1 hobbit. I had no idea they were anywhere near the place,"
said Pippin. He knew the story well. Bilbo and Frodo had told it often, but as a matter of fact he had never more than half believed it. Even now he looked at the stone trolls with suspicion, wondering if some magic might not suddenly bring them to life again. "Only your family history, but all you ever knew about trolls," said Strider. "It is broad daylight, with a bright sun, and yet you come back trying to scare me with a tale of live trolls waiting for us in this glade. In any case, you might have noticed that one of them has an old bird's nest behind his ear, and would be a most unusual ornament for a live troll." They all laughed. Frodo felt his spirits reviving. The reminder of Bilbo's first successful adventure was heartening. The sun, too, was warm and comforting, and the mist before his eyes seemed to be lifting a little. They rested for some time in the glade, and took their midday meal right under the shadow of the troll's large legs.
"Won't somebody give us a bit of a song while the sun is high?"
said Merry, when they had finished.
"We haven't had a song or tale for days." "Not since Weathertop,"
said Frodo. The others looked at him.
"Don't worry about me," he added. "I feel much better, but I don't think I could sing. Perhaps Sam could dig something out of his memory." "Come on, Sam," said Merry. "There's more stored in your head than you let on about." I don't know about that," said Sam. "But how would this suit? It ain't what I call proper poetry, but you understand me. Just a bit of nonsense. But these old images here brought it to my mind."
Standing up with his hands behind his back as if he was at school, he began to sing to an old tune.
Trolls sat alone in a seat of stone, and munched and mumbled a bare old bone. For many a year he had gnawed it near, for meat was hard to come by, done by, come by. In a cave in the hills he dwelt alone, and meat was hard to come by. Up came Tom with his big boots on. Said he to Troll, "Pray, what is yon? For it looks like the shin on my Uncle Tim, as should be lying in graveyard, caveyard, paveyard. This many a year has Tim been gone, and I thought he were lying in graveyard." "My lad," said Troll, "this bone I stole, but what be bones that lie in a hole? Thy uncle was dead as a lump o' lead, afore I found his chin bone, tin bone, thin bone. He can spare a share of a poor old troll, for he don't need his shin bone." Said Tom, "I don't see why the likes of thee, without axe and leave, should go making free with the shank of the shin o' my father's kin. So hand the old bone over, rover, trover. Though dead he be, it belongs to he, so hand the old bone over." "For a couple o' pins," says Troll and Gringe, "I'll eat thee too and gnaw thy shins. A bit o' fresh meat will go down sweet. I'll try my teeth on thee now. He now, see now. I'm tired o' gnawing at old bones and skins. I've mind to dine on thee now." But just as he thought his dinner was caught, he found his hands has hold of naught. Before he could mind, Tom slipped behind and gave him the boot to larn him, warn him, darn him. A bump of the boot on the seat Tom thought would be the way to larn him. But harder than the stone is the flesh and bone of a troll that sits in the hills alone, as well as your boot on the mountain's root. For the seat of a troll don't feel it, peel it, heel it. Old Troll laughed when he heard Tom groan, and he knew his toes could feel it. Tom's leg is game since home he came, and his bootless foot is lasting lame. But Frodo don't care, and he's still there, with the bone he boned from his owner. Donor, boner. Frodo's seat is still the same, and the bone that he boned from his owner.
Well, that's a warning to us all,
laughed Merry.
It is as well as you used a stick, but not your hand, Strider. Where'd you come by that, Sam?
Asked Pippin.
I've never heard those words before.
Sam muttered something inaudible,
It's out of his own head, of course.
said Frodo.
I'm learning a lot about Sam Gamgee on this journey. First he was a conspirator, now he's a jester. He'll end up by becoming a wizard, or a warrior. Oh, I hope not,
said Sam.
I don't want to be neither.
In the afternoon they went on down the woods. They were probably following the very track that Gandalf, Bilbo, and the dwarves had used many years before. After a few miles they came out on the top of a high bank above the road. At this point the road had left the Horwell far behind in its narrow valley, and now clung close to the feet of the hills, rolling and winding eastward among the woods and heather-covered slopes towards the ford in the mountains. Not far down the bank Strider pointed out a stone in the grass. On it, roughly cut and now much weathered, could still be seen dwarf runes and secret marks.
There,
said Merry.
that must be the stone that marked the place where the troll's gold was hidden. How much of it is left of Bilbo's share, I wonder, Frodo?
Frodo looked at the stone and wished that Bilbo had brought home no treasure more perilous or less easy to part with.
None at all,
he said.
Bilbo gave it all away. He told me he did not feel it was really his, as it came from robbers.
The road lay quiet under the long shadows of early evening. There was no sign of any other travellers to be seen. As there was now no other possible course for them to take, they climbed down the bank and, turning left, went off as fast as they could. Soon a shoulder of hills cut off the light of the fast westering sun. A cold wind flowed down to meet them from the mountains ahead. They were beginning to look out for a place off the road where they could camp for the night, when they heard a sound that brought sudden fear back into their hearts. The noise of hooves behind them. They looked back, but they could not see far because of the many windings and rollings of the road. As quickly as they could, they scrambled off the beaten way and up into the deep heather and bilberry patch, and thick-growing hazels. As they peered out from among the bushes, they could see the road, faint and grey in the failing light, some 30 feet below them. The sound of hooves drew nearer. They were going fast, with a light clippity-clippity-clip. Then faintly, as if it was blown away from them by the breeze, they seemed to catch a dim ringing, as of small bells tinkling.
That does not sound like a Black Rider's horse,
said Frodo, listening intently. The other hobbits agreed hopefully that it did not, but they all remained full of suspicion. They had been in fear of pursuit for so long that any sound from behind them seemed ominous and unfriendly. But Strider was now leaning forward, stooped to the ground, with a hand to his ear, and a look of joy on his face. The light faded, and the leaves on the brushes rustled softly. Clearer and nearer now the bells jingled, and clippity-clip came the quick trotting feet. Suddenly into view below came a white horse, gleaming in the shadows, running swiftly. In the dusk its headstall flickered and flashed, as if it were studded with the gems like living stars. The rider's cloak streamed behind him, and his hood was thrown back. His golden hair flowed shimmering in the wind of his speed. To Frodo it appeared that the white light was shining through the form and raiment of the rider, as if through a thin veil. Strider sprang from hiding and dashed down towards the road, leaping with a cry through the heather, but even before he had moved or called, the rider had reined his horse and halted, looking up towards the thicket where they stood. When he saw Strider, he dismounted and ran to meet him, calling out, His speech and clear ringing voice left no doubt in their hearts. The rider was of elven folk. No others that dwelt in the wide world had voices so fair to hear. But there seemed to be a note of haste or fear in his call, and they saw that he was now speaking quickly and urgently to Strider. Soon Strider beckoned to them. The hobbits left the bushes and hurried down to the road.
This is Glorfindel, who dwells in the house of Elrond,
said Strider. Hail and well met at last, said the elf lord to Frodo. I was sent from Rivendell to look for you. We fear that you are in danger upon the road.
Then Gandalf has reached Rivendell,
cried Frodo joyfully. No, "We had not when I departed, but that was 9 days ago," answered Glorfindel. "Elrond received news that troubled him. Some of my kindred journeying in your land beyond the Baranduin learned that things were amiss, and sent messages as swiftly as they could. They said that the Nine were abroad, and you were astray, bearing a great burden without guidance, for Gandalf had not returned. There are few, even in Rivendell, that can ride openly against the Nine, but such as there were, Elrond sent out north, west, and south. It was thought that you might run far aside to avoid pursuit and become lost in the wilderness. It was my lot to take the road, and I came to the bridge to Mithaethel and left a token there. Nigh on 7 days ago, 3 of the servants of Sauron were upon the bridge, but they withdrew, and I pursued them westward. I came also upon 2 others, but they turned away southward. Since then I searched for your trail. 2 days ago I found it, and found it over the bridge, and today I marked where you descended from the hills again. But come, there is no time for further news. Since you are here, we must risk the peril of the road and go. There are 5 behind us, and when they find your trail upon the road, they will ride after us like the wind. And they are not all. Where the other 4 may be, I do not know. I fear that we may find the ford is already held against us." While Glorfindel was speaking, the shades of evening deepened. Frodo felt a great weariness come over him. Ever since the sun began to sink, the mist before his eyes had darkened, and he felt that a shadow was coming between him and the faces of his friends. Now pain assailed him, and he felt cold. He swayed, clutching at Sam's arm.
"My master's sick and wounded,"
said Sam angrily.
"He can't go on riding at nightfall. He needs rest."
Glorfindel caught Frodo as he sank to the ground, and taking him gently in his arms, he looked in his face with grave anxiety. Briefly, Strider told of the attack on their camp on the Weathertop, and of the deadly knife. He drew out the hilt, which he had kept, and handed it to the elf. Glorfindel shuddered as he took it, but he looked intently at it. "There are evil things written on this hilt," he said, "though maybe your eyes cannot see them. Keep it, Aragorn, till we reach the house of Elrond. But be wary, and handle it as little as you may. Alas, the wounds of this weapon are beyond my skill to heal. I will do what I can. All the more do I urge you now to go on without rest." He searched the wound on Frodo's shoulder with his fingers, and his face grew graver, as if what he learned disquieted him. But Frodo felt the chill lessen in his side and arm. A little warmth crept down from his shoulder to his hand, and the pain grew easier. The dusk of evening seemed to grow lighter about him, as if a cloud had been withdrawn. He saw his friends' faces more clearly again, and a measure of new hope and strength returned. "You shall ride on my horse," said Glorfindel. "I will shorten the stirrups up to the saddle skirts, and you must sit as tight as you can. But you need not fear. My horse will not let any rider fall that I command him to bear. His pace is light and smooth, and if danger presses too near, he will bear you away with a speed that even the black steeds of the enemy cannot rival."
"No, he will not," said Frodo. "I shall not ride him. If I am to be carried off to Rivendell or anywhere else, leaving my friends behind in danger."
Glorfindel smiled. "I doubt very much," he said, "if your friends would be in danger if you were not with them. The pursuit would follow you and leave us in peace, I think. It is you, Frodo, and that which you bear that brings us all in peril." To that Frodo had no answer, and he was persuaded to mount Glorfindel's white horse. The pony was laden instead with the great part of the other's burdens, so that they now marched lighter, and for a time made good speed, but the hobbits began to find it hard to keep up with the swift, tireless feet of the elf. On he led them, into the mouth of darkness, and still on under the deep clouded night. There was neither star nor moon. Not until the grey of dawn did he allow them to halt. Pippin, Merry, and Sam were by that time nearly asleep in their stumbling legs, and even Strider seemed by the sag of his shoulders to be weary. Frodo sat upon the horse in a dark dream. And they cast themselves down in the heather a few yards from the roadside, and fell asleep immediately. They seemed hardly to have closed their eyes when Glorfindel, who had set himself to watch while they slept, awoke them again. The sun had now climbed far into the morning, and the clouds and mists of the night were gone. "Drink this," said Glorfindel to them, pouring for each in turn a little liquor from his silver-studded flask of leather. It was clear as spring water and had no taste, and it did not feel either cool or warm in the mouth, but strength and vigour seemed to flow into all their limbs as they drank it. Eaten after that draught, the stale bread and dried fruit, which was now all they had left, seemed to satisfy their hunger better than many a good breakfast in the Shire had done. They had rested rather less than 5 hours when they took to the road again, Glorfindel still urged them on, and only allowed 2 brief halts during the day's march. In this way they covered almost 20 miles before nightfall, and came to a point where the road bent right and ran down towards the bottom of the valley, now making straight for the Bruinen. So far there had been no sign or sound of pursuit that the hobbits could see or hear, but often Glorfindel would halt and listen for a moment. If they lagged behind, a look of anxiety clouded his face. Once or twice he spoke to Strider in the elf tongue. But however anxious their guides might be, it was plain that the hobbits could go no further that night. They were stumbling along dizzy with weariness and unable to think of anything but their feet and legs. Frodo's pain had redoubled, and during the day things about him faded to shadows of ghostly grey. He almost welcomed the coming of night, for then the world seemed less pale and empty. The hobbits were still weary when they set out again early next morning. There were many miles yet to go between them and the ford, and they hobbled forward at the best pace they could manage. "Our peril will be greater just ere we reach the river," said Glorfindel, "for my heart warns me that the pursuit is now swift behind us, and other dangers may be waiting by the ford." The road was still running steadily downhill, and there was now in places much grass at either side, in which the hobbits walked when they could, to ease their tired feet. In the late afternoon they came to a place where the road went suddenly under the dark shadow of tall pine trees, and then plunged into a deep cutting with steep moist walls of red stone. Echoes ran along as they hurried forward, and there seemed to be a sound of many footfalls following their own. All at once, as if through a gate of light, the road ran out again from the end of the tunnel into the open. There, at the bottom of the sharp incline, they saw before them a long flat mile, and beyond that the ford of Rivendell. On the further side was a steep brown bank, threaded by a winding path, and behind that the tall mountains climbed, shoulder above shoulder, and peak beyond peak, into the fading sky. There was still an echo as of following feet in the cutting behind them, a rushing noise as if a wind were rising and pouring through the branches of the pines. One moment Glorfindel turned and listened. Then he sprang forward with a loud cry. He called. The white horse leaped forward. The hobbits ran down the slope. Glorfindel and Strider followed as rear guard. They were only halfway across the flat when suddenly there was a noise of horses galloping. Out of the gate in the tree that they had just left rode a black rider. He reined his horse in and halted, swaying in his saddle. Another followed him, and then another, and then again 2 more. "Ride, forward, ride!" cried Glorfindel to Frodo. He did not obey at once, for a strange reluctance seized him. Checking the horse to a walk, he turned and looked back. The riders seemed to sit upon their great steeds like threatening statues upon a hill, dark and solid, while all the woods and land above them receded as if into a mist. Suddenly he knew in his heart that they were silently commanding him to wait. Then at once fear and hatred awoke in him. His hand left the bridle and gripped the hilt of his sword, and with the red flash he drew it. "Ride on! Ride on!" cried Glorfindel, and then loud and clear he called to the horse in the elf tongue. "Norolim! Norolim Asfaloth!" At once the white horse sprang away and sped like the wind along the last lap of the road. At the same moment the black horses leaped down the hill in pursuit, and from the riders came a terrible cry, such as Frodo had heard filling the woods with horror in the east farthing far away. It was answered, and to the dismay of Frodo and his friends out from the trees and rocks away on the left 4 other riders came flying. 2 rode towards Frodo, 2 galloped madly toward the ford to cut off his escape. They seemed to him to run like the wind, and to grow swiftly larger and darker as their courses converged with his. Frodo looked back for a moment over his shoulder. He could no longer see his friends. The riders behind were falling back. Even their great steed were no match in speed for the white elf horse of Glorfindel. He looked forward again, and hope faded. There seemed no chance of reaching the ford before he was cut off by the others that had lain in ambush. He could see them clearly now. They appeared to have cast aside their hoods and black cloaks, and they were robed in white and grey. Swords were naked in their pale hands. Helms were on their heads. Their cold eyes glittered, and they called to him with fell voices. Fear now filled all Frodo's mind. He thought no longer of his sword. No cry came from him. He shut his eyes and clung to the horse's mane. The wind whistled in his ears, and the bells upon the harness rang wild and shrill. A breath of deadly cold pierced him like a spear, as if with a last spurt, like a flash of white fire. The elf horse, speeding as if on wings, passed right before the face of the foremost rider. Frodo heard the splash of water. It foamed above his feet. He felt the quick heave and surge as the horse left the river and struggled up the stony path. He was climbing the steep bank. He was across the ford. But the pursuers were close behind. At the top of the bank the horse halted and turned about, neighing fiercely. There were 9 riders at the water's edge below, and Frodo's spirit quailed before the threat of their uplifted faces. He knew of nothing that would prevent them from crossing as easily as he had done, and he felt that it was useless to try to escape over the long uncertain path from the ford to the edge of Rivendell, if once the riders crossed. In any case, he felt that he was commanded urgently to halt. Hatred again stirred in him, but he had no longer the strength to refuse. Suddenly the foremost rider spurred his horse forward. It checked at the water and reared up. With a great effort, Frodo sat upright and brandished his sword.
Go back! Go back!
He cried.
Go back to the land of Mordor! And follow me no more!
His voice sounded thin and shrill in his own ears. The riders halted, but Frodo had not the power of Bombadil. His enemies laughed at him with a harsh and chilling laughter. They called,
Mordor will take you. Go back.
he whispered.
Go back. Hurry.
They cried with deadly voices, and immediately their leader urged his horse forward into the water, followed closely by 2 others.
By Elbereth and Luthien the Fair,
said Frodo with a last effort, lifting up his sword.
you shall have neither the ring nor me.
Then the leader, who was now half across the ford, stood up menacing in his stirrups, and raised up his hand. Frodo was stricken dumb. He felt his tongue cleave to his mouth, and his heart labouring. His sword broke and fell out of his shaking hand. The elf horse reared and snorted. The foremost of the black horses had almost set foot upon the shore. At that moment there came a roaring and a rushing. A noise of loud waters rolled many stones. Dimly Frodo saw the river below him rise, and down along its course there came a plumed cavalry of waves. White flames seemed to Frodo to flicker on their crests, and he half fancied what he saw amid the water white riders upon white horses with frothing manes. The 3 riders that were still in the midst of the ford were overwhelmed. They disappeared, buried suddenly under angry foam. Those that were behind drew back in dismay. With his last failing senses, Frodo heard cries, and it seemed to him that he saw, beyond the riders that hesitated on the shore, a shining figure of white light, and behind it ran small shadowy forms waving flames. It flared red in the grey mist that was falling over the world. The black horses were filled with madness, and leaping forward in terror they bore their riders into the rushing flood. Their piercing cries were drowned in the roaring of the river as it carried them away. Then Frodo felt himself falling, and the roaring and confusion seemed to rise and engulf him together with his enemies. He heard and saw no more. Frodo woke and found himself lying in bed. At first he thought that he had slept late, after a long unpleasant dream that still hovered on the edge of memory. Or perhaps he had been ill, but the ceiling looked strange. It was flat, and it had dark beams richly carved. He lay a little while longer, looking at patches of sunlight on the wall, and listening to the sound of waterfall.
Where am I? And what is the time?
He said aloud to the ceiling.
In the house of Elrond, and it is 10 o'clock in the morning,
said a voice.
It is the morning of October the 24th, if you want to know.
Gandalf! cried Frodo, sitting up. There was the old wizard, sitting in a chair by the open window.
Yes, he said, I am here. And you are lucky to be here too, after all the absurd things you have done since you left home.
Frodo lay down again. He felt too comfortable and peaceful to argue, and in any case he did not think he would get the better of any argument. He was fully awake now, and the memory of his journey was returning. The disastrous short-cut through the old forest, the accident of the prancing pony, and his madness in putting on the ring in the dell under the weathertop. While he was thinking of all these things and trying in vain to bring his memory down to his arriving in Rivendell, there was a long silence, broken slowly by the soft puffs of Gandalf's pipe as he blew white smoke rings out the window.
Where is Sam?
Frodo asked at length.
And are the others all right?
Yes, they are all safe and sound, answered Gandalf. Sam was here until I sent him off to get some rest about half an hour ago.
What happened at the ford?
Said Frodo.
It all seemed so dim somehow, and it still does.
Yes, it would. You are beginning to fade, answered Gandalf. The wound was overcoming you at last. A few more hours and you would have been beyond our aid. But you have some strength in you, my dear Hobbit, as you showed in the barrow. That was touch and go, perhaps the most dangerous moment of all. I wish you could have held out at Weathertop.
You seem to know a great deal already,
said Frodo.
I have not spoken to the others about the barrow. At first it was too horrible, and afterwards there were other things to think about. How do you know about it?
You have talked long in your sleep, Frodo, said Gandalf gently, and it has not been hard for me to read your mind and memory. Do not worry. Though I said absurd just now, I did not mean it. I think well of you, and of the others. It is no small feat to have come so far, and through such dangers, still bearing the ring.
We should never have done it without Strider, said Frodo. But we needed you. I did not know what to do without you.
I was delayed, said Gandalf, and that nearly proved our ruin. And yet I am not sure. It may have been better so.
I wish you would tell me what happened.
All in good time. You are not supposed to talk or worry about anything today. By Elrond's orders.
But talking would stop me thinking and wondering, which are quite as tiring,
said Frodo.
I'm wide awake now, and I remember so many things that want explaining. Why were you delayed? You ought to tell me that at least.
You will soon hear all you wish to know, said Gandalf. We shall have a council, as soon as you are well enough. At the moment I will only say that I was held captive.
You?
cried Frodo.
Yes, I, Gandalf the Grey, said the wizard solemnly. There are many powers in this world, for good or for evil. Some are greater than I am. Against some I have not yet been measured. But my time is coming. The Morgul Lord and his Black Riders have come forth. War is preparing.
Then you knew of the Riders already? Before I met them?
Yes, I knew of them. Indeed, I spoke of them once to you, for the Black Riders are the Ringwraiths, the 9 servants of the Lord of the Rings. But I did not know that they had arisen again, or I should have fled with you at once. I heard news of them only after I left you in June. But that story must wait. For the moment we have been saved from disaster by Aragorn.
Yes, said Frodo. It was Strider that saved us. Yet I was afraid of him at first. Sam never quite trusted him, I think. Not at any rate until we met Glorfindel.
Gandalf smiled.
I have heard all about Sam, he said. He has no more doubts now.
Oh, I am glad, said Frodo, for I've become very fond of Strider. Well, fond is not the right word. I mean, he is dear to me, though he is strange and grim at times. In fact, he reminds me often of you. I didn't know that any of the big people were like that. I thought, well, that they were just big and rather stupid. Kind and stupid like Butterbur, or stupid and wicked like Bill Ferny. But then we don't know much about men in the Shire, except perhaps the Breelanders.
You don't know much even about them if you think old Barliman was stupid, said Gandalf. He is wise enough on his own ground. He thinks less than he talks, and slower, yet he can see through a brick wall in time, as they say in Bree. But there are a few left in Middle-earth like Aragorn, son of Arathorn. The race of kings from over the sea is nearly at an end, and maybe that this War of the Ring will be their last adventure.
What? Do you really mean that Strider is one of the people of the old kings? Said Frodo in wonder. I thought they had all vanished long ago. I thought he was only a ranger.
Only a ranger? Cried Gandalf. My dear Frodo, that is just what rangers are. The last remnant in the north of the great people. The men of the west. They have helped me before, and I shall need their help in the days to come. For we have reached Rivendell, but the ring is not yet at rest.
I suppose not, said Frodo. But so far my only thought has been to get here, and I hope that I shan't have to go any further. It's very pleasant just to rest. I have had a month of exile and adventure, and I find that has been as much as I want.
He fell silent and shut his eyes. After a while he spoke again.
I have been reckoning, he said, but I can't bring the total up to October the 24th. It ought to be the 21st. We must have reached the ford by the 20th.
You have walked and reckoned more than is good for you, said Gandalf. How do the side and shoulder feel now?
I don't know, Frodo answered. They don't feel at all, which is an improvement, but...
He made an effort.
I can move my arm again a little. Yes, it's coming back to life. It's not cold,
he added, touching his left hand with his right.
Good,
said Gandalf.
It is mending fast. You will soon be sound again. Elrond has cured you. He has tended you for days, ever since you were brought in.
Days?
Said Frodo.
Well, 4 nights and 3 days, to be exact. The elves brought you from the ford on the night of the 20th, and that is where you lost count. We have been terribly anxious, and Sam has hardly left your side, day or night, except to run messages. Elrond is a master of healing, but the weapons of our enemy are deadly. To tell you the truth, I had very little hope, for I suspected that there was some fragment of the blade still in the closed wound, but it could not be found until last night. Then Elrond removed a splinter. It was deeply buried, and it was working inwards.
Frodo shuddered, remembering the cruel knife with notched blade that had vanished in Strider's hands.
Don't be alarmed, said Gandalf. It is gone now. It has been melted, and it seems that hobbits fade very reluctantly. I have known strong warriors of the big people who would quickly have been overcome by that splinter which you bore for 17 days.
What would they have done to me? Asked Frodo. What were the riders trying to do?
They tried to pierce your heart with a Morgul knife which remains in the wound. If they had succeeded, you would have become like they are, only weaker, and under their command. You would have become a wraith, under the dominion of the Dark Lord, and he would have tormented you for trying to keep his ring. If any greater torment were possible than being robbed of it and seeing it on his hand.
Thank goodness I did not realize the horrible danger,
said Frodo faintly.
I was mortally afraid, of course, but if I had not known more, I would not have dared even to move. It is a marvel that I escaped.
Yes, fortune or fate have helped you, said Gandalf. Not to mention courage, for your heart was not touched, and only your shoulder was pierced. And that was because you resisted to the last. But it was a terribly narrow shave, so to speak. You were in gravest peril while you wore the ring. For then you were in half the wraith world yourself, and they might have seized you. You could see them, and they could see you.
I know, said Frodo. They were terrible to behold. But why could we all see their horses?
Because they are real horses, just as the black robes are real robes that they wear to give shape to their nothingness when they have dealings with the living.
Then why do these black horses endure such riders? All other animals are terrified when they draw near, even the elf horse of Glorfindel. The dogs howl and the geese scream at them.
Because these horses are born and bred to the service of the Dark Lord in Mordor. Not all his servants and chattels are wraiths. There are orcs and trolls, there are wargs and werewolves, and there have been and still are many men, warriors and kings, that walk alive under the sun, and yet are under his sway, and their number is growing daily.
What about Rivendell and the elves? Is Rivendell safe?
Yes, at present, until all else is conquered. The elves may fear the Dark Lord, and they may fly before him, but never again will they listen to him or serve him. And here in Rivendell there live still some of his chief foes, the elven-wise lords of the Eldar from beyond the furthest seas. They do not fear the ring-race, for those who have dwelt in the blessed realm live at once in both worlds, and against both the seen and the unseen they have great power.
I thought that I saw a white figure that shone and did not grow dim like the others. Was that Glorfindel then?
Yes, you saw him for a moment as he is upon the other side, one of the mighty of the firstborn. He is an elf lord of a house of princes. Indeed, there is a power in Rivendell to withstand the might of Mordor for a while, and elsewhere other powers still dwell. There is power, too, of another kind in the Shire, but all such places will soon become islands under siege, if things go on as they are going. The Dark Lord is putting forth all his strength.
Still, he said, standing suddenly up and sticking out his chin while his beard went stiff and straight like bristling wire,
we must keep up our courage. You will soon be well if I do not talk you to death. You are in Rivendell, and you need not worry about anything for the present.
I haven't any courage to keep up, said Frodo. But I'm not worried at the moment. Just give me news of my friends until the end of the affair at the ford, as I keep on asking, and I shall be content for the present. After that I shall have another sleep, I think. But I shan't be able to close my eyes until you've finished the story for me.
Gandalf moved his chair to the bedside and took a good look at Frodo. The colour had come back to his face, and his eyes were clear and fully awake and aware. He was smiling, and there seemed to be little wrong with him. But to the wizard's eye there was a faint change. Just a hint, as it were, of transparency about him, and especially about the left hand that lay outside upon the coverlet.
Still, that must be expected, said Gandalf to himself. He is not half through yet, and to what he will come in the end not even Elrond can foretell. Not to evil, I think. He may become like a glass filled with a clear light for eyes to see that can. You look splendid, he said aloud. I will risk a brief tale without consulting Elrond, but quite brief, mind you, and then you must sleep again. This is what happened, as far as I can gather. The riders made straight for you, as soon as you fled. They did not need the guidance of their horses any longer. You had become visible to them, being already on the threshold of their world. And also the ring drew them. Your friends sprang aside off the road, or they would have been ridden down. They knew that nothing could save you if the white horse could not. The riders were too swift to overtake, and too many to oppose. On foot, even Glorfindel and Aragorn together could not withstand all the 9 at once. When the ring race swept by, your friends ran up behind. Close to the ford there is a small hollow beside the road, masked by a few stunted trees. There they hastily kindled fire, for Glorfindel knew that a flood would come down if the riders tried to cross, and then he would have to deal with any that were left on his side of the river. The moment the flood appeared, he rushed out, followed by Aragorn and the others with flaming brands. Caught between fire and water, and seeing an elf lord revealed in his wrath, they were dismayed, and their horses were stricken with madness. 3 were carried away by the first assault of the flood. The others were now hurled into the water by their horses and overwhelmed.
And is that the end of the Black Riders? Asked Frodo.
No, said Gandalf. Their horses must have perished, and without them they are crippled, but the ring wraiths themselves cannot be so easily destroyed. However, there is nothing more to fear from them at the present. Your friends crossed after the flood has passed, and they found you lying on your face at the top of the bank, with a broken sword under you. The horse was standing guard beside you. You were pale and cold, and they fear that you are dead, or worse. Elrond's folk met them, carrying you slowly towards Rivendell.
Who made the flood? Asked Frodo.
Elrond commanded it, answered Gandalf. The river of this valley is under his power, and it will rise in anger when he has great need to bar the ford. As soon as the captain of the ring race strode into the water, the flood was released. If I may say so, I added a few touches of my own. You may not have noticed, but some of the waves took the form of great white horses with shining white riders, and there were many rolling and grinding boulders. For a moment I was afraid that we let loose too fierce a wrath, and the flood would get out of hand and wash you all away. There is great vigour in the waters that come down from the snows of the misty mountains.
Yes, it all comes back to me now, said Frodo. The tremendous roaring. I thought I was drowning, with my friends and enemies and all. But now we are safe.
Gandalf looked quickly at Frodo, but he had shut his eyes.
Yes, you are all safe for the present. Soon there will be feasting and merrymaking to celebrate the victory at the ford of Bruinen, and you will all be there in places of honour.
Splendid, said Frodo. It is wonderful that Elrond and Glorfindel and such great lords, not to mention Strider, would take so much trouble and show me so much kindness.
Well, there are many reasons why they should, said Gandalf, smiling. I am one reason. The ring is another. You are the ring-bearer, and you are the heir of Bilbo, the ring-finder.
Oh, dear Bilbo, said Frodo sleepily. I wonder where he is. I wish he was here and could hear all about it. It would have made him laugh. The cow jumped over the moon, and the poor old troll.
With that, he fell fast asleep.
Frodo was now safe in the last homely house, east of the sea. That house was, as Bilbo had long ago reported, a perfect house. Whether you like food or sleep or storytelling or singing or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of them all. Merely to be there was a cure for weariness, fear, and sadness. As the evening drew on, Frodo woke up again, and he found that he no longer felt the need to rest or sleep, but had a mind for food and drink, and probably for singing and storytelling afterwards. He got out of bed, that his arm was already nearly as useful again as it ever had been. He found laid ready clean garments of green cloth that fitted him excellently. Looking in a mirror, he was startled to see a much thinner reflection of himself than he remembered. It looked remarkably like the young nephew of Bilbo who used to go tramping with his uncle in the Shire, but the eyes looked out at him thoughtfully. "Yes, you have seen a thing or two since you last peeped out of a looking-glass," he said in his reflection. "But now for a merrymaking." He stretched out his arms and whistled a tune. At that moment there was a knock on the door, and Sam came in. He ran to Frodo and took his left hand, awkwardly and shyly. He stroked it gently, and then he blushed and turned hastily away. "Hello, Sam," said Frodo. "It's warm," said Sam. "Meaning your hand, Mr. Frodo. It has felt so cold through the long nights. But glory and trumpets!" he cried, turning around again with shining eyes and dancing on the floor. "It's fine to see you up and yourself again, sir. Gandalf asked me to come and see if you were ready to come down, and I thought he was joking." "I am ready," said Frodo. "Let's go and look for the rest of the party." "I can take you to them, sir," said Sam. "It's a big house, this, and very peculiar. Always a bit more to discover, and no knowing what you will find around a corner. And elves, sir. Elves here and elves there. Some like kings, terrible and splendid, and some merry as children. And the music and the singing, not that I have had the time and heart for much listening since we got here, but I'm getting to know some of the ways of the place." "I know what you've been doing, Sam," said Frodo, taking his arm.